Welcome back to another episode of Coats in Conversation, where we have conversation around lifestyle, mental health, and education. I'm your host, Kendrick Coates. Again, we have got another great episode today, but before we get started, be sure to go out onto YouTube and like and subscribe to Coats in Conversation. You can also find Coats in Conversation podcast on Apple and Spotify. Today, we are going to have, as I mentioned, a great conversation with former University of Virginia, former athlete and graduate, Gio Veiga. Gio, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. I think the last time I saw you was on the tennis court, and you've got this like low key competitive nature to you. And I was like, oh, dang. But
Yeah.
before we start the conversation, I like to sometimes do a mental health check-in. How are you doing mentally today?
Good. I think things have been a good phase lately just with grad school, getting closer to graduation. A little bit of a Sunday scary just with everything that I have going on today, but
Mm.
all good.
Yeah, and it is kind of, and I forgot to mention, Gio is also in the Auburn University Marriage and Family Therapy program, as I am, and it is intense. And I think intense is an understatement, just given the expectations and the requirements that we have. And so I understand, as far as being on Sunday with everything that you have going on top of academic requirements and assistantship requirements. So things can be kind of hectic for sure.
Mhm.
So jumping into the conversation, so for people who don't know much about you, tell us a little bit about growing up in South America and how you ended up coming to the United States for undergrad.
Mhm. So I was born and raised in Brazil. I started playing squash. I'm gonna kind of explain what it is because a lot of people don't really know the sport. But it's pretty similar to racquetball. It's a court that looks just like a racquetball court, a little bit shorter, and it's a racket sport, similar to racquetball tennis. But basically, when I was about 6 years old, I started playing squash. It was kind of a thing that was running in the family, so my brother and my dad would play, and I would go as a little kid to watch the tournaments, and at some point I was just like, "Oh, I wanna start playing this too." So when I was about 6 years old, I started playing squash. As the years went on, I kept playing. I wanted to start traveling and competing on a more serious level. So probably when I was about 12 to 13 was when I made the shift into like, oh, I want for this to be more than just a hobby. So I started practicing. When I got older, I was very excited about the possibility of getting a scholarship to play squash in the US in college. So I kind of followed a little bit the footsteps of my older brother because he did play squash in the US and got a scholarship for that. So I started applying, kept practicing. Meanwhile, I was also traveling and representing Brazil on a couple of tournaments around South America and North America too. But when the time came, I was about to graduate high school, I started reaching out to different coaches in the US. And I eventually got a scholarship through the University of Virginia to go there and play for them. And that was pretty cool because they had a brand new, like, facility with, like, so many courts that you can't even see the end of it, but it was pretty cool to be able to not only to continue playing my sport, but just to move to an environment that would provide me with a great education, but also a lot more resources when it comes to being an athlete.
I'm curious to know, because in my mind, I'm just picturing being in South America and competing
Mhm.
in sports, and then knowing how sports are and just the expectations sometimes here in the United States. So, how was there much of a difference with how competitive sports were in South America versus the United States?
Yes, definitely. I think there are kind of 2 sides to that, but on one side, there was a difference with because I was from Brazil, a place that didn't have as many players, I had been competing and playing at all like Pan Americans, South Americans, and all of these tournaments that the American players weren't necessarily being able to play because there was just such a high pool of players in the US. So most of the girls that I went to school with played on the same team. They had not been able to compete in some of those tournaments that the girls from South America have been like able to do so for a longer time. I also think there was just a transition in like preparedness. So even like with physical conditioning, I remember when I got here, like to the US for the first time, my coach was like, your skills are impressive, like your shots and like all the technique, but you're really bad when it comes to conditioning. It's just like you were not doing the right things back there. So it was a bit of a huge transition for me just learning how to like improve my physical level and just like doing a lot of conditioning, way more intense and more squash specific cardio and just different exercises that helped me get there. And part of how I did that too was I took on running after moving here, just to help with squash. But that's something that before in Brazil, I was like, oh, I don't really need to run. I have these other things that I can do that will be helpful for squash, but was not the case.
Yeah, I would have thought that maybe in South America, it would have been a little bit more competitive. And I don't know why, but I just have seen, I guess, watching NBA sports with some
Mhm,
of the international athletes coming over that have more of sometimes this chip on their shoulder and a little bit more skilled. So, from what you'd mentioned with your coach saying that you're really skilled, is that something that is focused on when you were growing up? Is just basically building a strong foundation from a skill set or fundamental standpoint?
I think part of it, it's like just been worked on and through finding coaches with different styles. But I also think that part of it was from the lack of having other girls to play with. So my whole life, I grew up playing squash with old men. Um, and I just kind of had to learn the tricks and like the unconventional style to break up the game because I was not gonna be winning matches against them on my power or even on my conditioning, but it was more so with like the tricky shots or just breaking up the game a lot and using the age factor to help me basically. So I think that also was a huge contributor to my game being unconventional, as my coach would say, but
Yeah.
also surprising and like effective.
It's kind of funny you said that you would play with older athletes, and it's always surprising because I used to play a lot of golf,
Mhm,
and I used to play with um, older gentlemen or retirees,
mhm,
and they may not be as strong or powerful, but fundamentally, they had all the trick
mhm,
shots or just they had just a pocket of tricks of how they were able to score so low in golf, and I was always amazed because younger athletes, try to go out and overpower the ball,
mhm.
which I don't know if that's similar in squash, but yeah, the more seasoned veterans in some of these sports just know the ins and outs.
Yeah.
Um, when you were coming over to the United States and when you got here, did you have a expectation or were your expectations of what the United States would be like, were they altered after you got here?
Um, I think it was a little bit of like I didn't even know what to expect to some extent. I was amazed and impressed just about like it was the first time in my life that I was in a place that I had like 15 other girls that played the same level as me and we would go and practice every day and have all the infrastructure with like nutritionists or physical trainers, like every type of recovery just like recovery professionals to help us. So I was definitely impressed and did not expect that. And I think that made a huge difference with just like improving my level of squash. But I also think to some extent, I did not anticipate how it was going to be being on a team. And at the moment, like when I first came here, I was the first international student on the team. We had another girl from Hong Kong who had gone through like high school in the US and just kind of walked on the team. But I was the first like international recruit. So I had not anticipated some of the challenges that would come with that. And I think even as I was going through it, it was just like so much adjusting that I didn't realize some of the things that I was doing and how difficult it was. I kept hearing people be like, "Oh wow, like you're having such an easy time at this," and I was just like, "What do you mean? Like I'm not doing anything. I'm just like here." But I think looking back now, I can see that it was difficult being the only international student on the team, and not being able to relate to some of the other girls and some of the experiences that I've had growing up in South America.
Mhm. And yeah, I could imagine that it was difficult, which leads me into my next question. How did you cope with, some of those challenges that you had to overcome as being one of the only international students on the team, but then also having to adapt to just the completely different lifestyle here in the States?
I think adapting to the lifestyle was just a process that it's still happening to this day. So even with the language, culture, weather, like those are things that I'm still adapting to. But I think just by being here longer, you kind of get used to some of those things. But the one thing that I was very grateful to have was a place that really felt like home a little bit, or like at which everybody was trying to make me feel at home. So having my coach was huge just in connecting with other students that were from similar backgrounds as me. I think like the demographics of the team also changed when I was there. So I went from being the first, like only international in the first year, to having a 50% international to American ratio when I graduated 4 years later. Um, so I think he saw the need of like, okay, let's try to make the team feel like a unit, right? And like I was also able to help with the recruiting of some other girls who came from South America too, that I've been playing with like all my life growing up. So I think having a coach, a staff, and the other teammates that were trying to help me fit in and trying to help me meet people from similar backgrounds was helpful. And I think at some point too, I found a massive Brazilian community at UVA, which was fundamental and just like helping me succeed there.
It's always nice finding community, especially moving to a completely different area where things culturally are different.
Mhm,
And I'm sure there was maybe a bit of just a perspective, a different perspective on how the cultural norms here in the United States versus um, Brazil or South America. But so you were at Virginia, now you moved, made the jump to Auburn, which in my
mhm,
mind, I'm like, I think that's a completely 180-degree turn as far as culturally, adapting to a
mhm,
community, but we'll get into that a little bit later.
mhm,
How was the mental health aspect of things in South America? What was the attitude? Was it important? Was it something that was still kind of a
mhm.
taboo in some cases?
I think it was something that wasn't really talked about. So I had not had much exposure or much talking about just some of the challenges or like the mental struggles from being an athlete, right? And being highly in a highly competitive environment. I did growing up, I worked with a sports psychologist for some time. It was actually very interesting. I had this opponent that I could not beat, and every time I got closer to it, I was like having a match point or something, I would throw up just from being so
Mm.
nervous and like maybe thinking like, "Oh, I'm finally gonna beat this girl." So that brought me to seek professional help, and at the time, it was mostly a CBT focused therapy, but I learned a lot of skills, breathing, things to do before a match that helped me be able to get over some of those nerves and eventually beat that opponent. But more importantly, just improve my mental skills as an athlete, right? Um, I do wanna say that that was highly acceptable. So, like, nobody looked at me weird or said anything because I was seeing a sports psychologist. But I do think that in other contexts, when it's just like, because people would ask, "Oh, what are you doing?" I was just gonna be like, I had my little notebook and was doing the exercises before a match, and they were like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I like work with a therapist, and this is what they're helping me with." But when I said that it was for like my performance, then people would be like, "Oh yeah, no, that makes sense." But I think sometimes with just personal problems, or if I wasn't an athlete, that would be something that would be shocking, or people would assume that something was bad or wrong
Mhm.
with me.
What age was that you started working with a sports psychologist?
I was about 14 at the time, I believe.
Okay. And I may be dating myself a little bit. So I think when we're talking about mental health, especially on the sports level,
Mhm,
back when I was competing in high school and college, it
mhm,
was something that we just didn't even talk about. You were kind of explaining, you would throw up before a specific competition, and again, dating myself, going back when we had, and I remember athletes having those similar experiences. We thought, oh, well, he or she just ate something, or,
mhm, mhm,
the person's in their head. And so, would you say that, how do you look at, I guess, therapy now, just generally speaking, since now that you have had the experience of working with a sports psychologist?
mhm. Well, I think I'm definitely grateful that, like you said, I was able to realize that it was, like, something else, right, and not just a physical symptom. Because I think the first time it happened, that's what I thought too, that's what people thought, but then after it happened a couple of times and I started connecting the dots, I was like, "I think there might be something else here going on," and I was able to get a referral from somebody else who, like, was also an athlete and had gone through something similar. But I think it shifted my perspective just in a sense of like, sometimes we think that like, oh, there's no way out of this, or this is just something that's going to happen. And I think having worked with that psychologist was something that showed me like, no, like it shouldn't be like this, like you can work on getting through this. And there are techniques, there are people that are there to help you. So I think it shifted my perspective just in being like, kind of never settle for what's going on. And if you want to seek help and you believe something is preventing you from succeeding, then it's always good to kind of look for it.
I'm curious to know. So you had that experience in when you were in high school, and
Mhm.
then going back to as you were a collegiate athlete, did
Yeah.
you or can you remember any experiences that you've had to where you saw other athletes dealing with similar issues, and were you able to kind of provide them kind of that courage to seek out some type of mental health professional to help them get through whatever issue or roadblock that they were facing?
Yeah, yeah. I would definitely say so. One of the biggest challenges from being on the team is that we were kind of like this big family, everybody's friends with everybody, but then we would have challenge matches to decide who's playing what number on the ladder, right? And some of those matches you could be playing your best friend and be like, if I lose this match, I'm out of the competition next week because I didn't make top nine in the team. So I was able to see a lot of my peers like struggle or sometimes not be able to be competitive during those matches, just like because it's a hard adjustment. And we did have a sports psychologist that worked with the team. So most of her work was about just like team dynamics and making sure we were all like in a good place as a team. But then I've done it myself and I've indicated to other peers too that it would be a good idea to just seek individual help from that same therapist. So that's a very cool thing that we had access to, just not as a team, but if, oh, I have this big match coming up, I'm a little nervous, let me go and schedule a session with her before and just talk it through. Um, and while still using some of the techniques that I had learned in my own individual work with the sports psychologist before. Yeah.
I think there's so much power in that, especially you having the experience, and not all athletes that we've been around have had the experience of going to see a sports psychologist or a therapist. And so I think the power in that is actually having peers that have gone down that route of getting the help and normalizing it, because I still think in some sense a lot of it in male sports, and I think it's a little bit of a guy thing, that we don't like to talk about things. And
Mhm.
so that's where, like you said, having the family and the community within your team, that y'all were close enough to be able to be transparent and speak to one another about some of the issues. But then also, you were kind of, I'd imagine, somewhat of a resource in, again, normalizing the going out and seeking out some type of therapy or seeing a sports psychologist, which, again, I think when we can see other people go down that route or explore those type of services, it's a little bit of an easier transition versus somebody going for the very first time, or maybe thinking about it and not having any type of support around them. So that's really cool. The kind of staying on the topic of mental health, you were an athlete during COVID, and I
Mhm.
know there were even coaches have some of the coaches that I've talked to have said, "Wow, like COVID was the hardest thing that our team or our coaches have ever dealt with." What was your
Mhm.
experience going through COVID as a collegiate athlete?
Yeah. There were a couple of nuances to my experience. I think from being an international student, what ended up happening is that I went back home just to be with my family when everything first started. And there was a travel ban between Brazil and the US, so I couldn't really travel back to college once the school opened up again. So basically, I had to do a semester and a half at home. For the first part of it, there weren't any competitions or any matches or practicing, so it was okay. But for the second part of it, most of my teammates were back and practicing, and I was not able to be there. So that was extremely challenging. It was my senior year. I was a captain on the team, and I was having to talk to people through Zoom or only interact with the coaches and other teammates on calls and like couldn't really be a part of the training that they were doing. I think in my case, I really used that as fuel to practicing even more so. So I ended up just finding a coach back at home, hiring them full time, explaining everything that my teammates were doing here in the US and just being like, how can you take me there? Um, so that was definitely very helpful to have somebody that like we would practice together every day and we were doing the same things that my teammates were. So even another way we found to connect was like we had the Whoop watches. I don't know if you've heard of
Mhm.
those. But basically we had a team on the app and we could see every day all the things that each one of us were doing. So I could kind of compare like how my practice went to how their practices went. Or we could kind of joke around and be like, "Oh, you had a like good workout today," or like, "Oh, rest day needed today." So that was very interesting. But I would definitely say that on a mental health level, I struggled at first to have to figure out things by myself and kind of new ways to like engage with my teammates and maintain that connection, right? And then the rough part about it too was when I finally was able to come back to the US, the squash season got canceled because things were not looking better. So I ended up not having a season at all my senior year, which was kind of rough. But I'm still very glad that I had the opportunity to practice, improve my level, was probably the best squash that I've ever played, was right like when all of that happened. And for the last couple of months of my senior year that I was able to be in the US, even though we weren't competing, we were still practicing. So I gained back like that ability to just like be with the team, be with the family, practice, play, joke around, and we even had like a scrimmage event kind of like to send off the seniors in which we played doubles and like with the parents and just had a really fun day everybody together.
It's awesome that y'all had at least, something to remember,
Mhm.
versus I know some athletes just didn't compete their last year and that was it.
Yeah.
And that's just, there are so many, whether middle school, high school, or collegiate, even professional, that
Mhm.
you can't get back those memories or that time. And so when everything was just like stopped cold turkey, it's like, well,
Yeah,
what do we do? And
yeah.
that's cool that y'all had even technology that kept you somewhat connected.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the positives that came from COVID is technology has just advanced in such a way that we are in some ways more connected than we've ever been. And so for a collegiate athlete like you and having the Whoop technology to see what your other peers were doing was like, okay, well, this person did this kind of workout. And knowing you being competitive, you're like, okay, let me one up them.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think we even had a Snapchat group too that we would send post-workout pictures and just, like, how much you sweated or things like that. So, it was definitely
Yeah,
good.
nice. So, what kind of advice would you give to an athlete who may be struggling with their own mental health and is kind of timid or hesitant to actually seek out professional help?
Yeah. I think something that can be helpful in bridging that gap, right? Because like you said, the first step towards seeking help is the biggest one and it's sometimes very daunting. So I would say just talk to somebody that maybe have gone through something similar. Because like in my case, when I was starting to wonder like, oh, is this like should I be like working with a psychologist, sports psychologist, having talked to somebody else who had done that and that got help through it, really made me like stop questioning it and just be like, oh wow, like let me try this, right? So I think talking, reaching out to somebody, and it could be a teammate, a coach, anything like that, that will help you get connected with the correct resources. That's definitely that would be my main piece of advice. But I think another part of it too is just like understanding the reality of being an athlete, right? Because I think like everybody goes through struggles and difficulties regularly. But then if you're also putting yourself in this position of like always being highly competitive and trying to beat not just other people, but you yourself, like, right? You're trying to be better every day and improve. So that mindset allows you to grow so much, but at the same time, it can be very like it adds a lot of pressure. So just normalize that. Like you're an athlete, just like you're taking care of your body through recovery and through physiotherapy, whatever it is, you need to take care of your mind because you're putting yourself in these extreme circumstances. And even like just talking about victories, losses, it's important as well to have time to process those.
hmm I like that when you mentioned just having time to process whatever an athlete may go through, especially when you have a competition and there's high expectations. So maybe a championship or a playoff game, and or even being injured or getting injured and being able to process the emotions that come with that. And I think the thing that many athletes have to understand is that we often take a lot of time or spend a lot of time on the recovery and the nutritional aspect and the conditioning and
Mhm,
training aspect of things to get our bodies where they need to be to compete at a high level. But sometimes we forget what is in between our ears, which is our minds.
mhm,
And it's kind of that the saying is, it's the brain body connection. And so as an athlete, I don't know how you were when you were an athlete, but I remember I was just such a feel person. I had to feel what I was doing. And if I had this disconnect between my brain and my body, it actually harmed my competitive nature and the things that I was able to do. And so I'm encouraged that you were, sought out a sports psychologist at such an early age that it's kind of propelled you into being able to talk about these things on the college level, but then also being able to seek out different resources. So it probably wasn't as daunting as scary to find those resources.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
So, as we transition to the next question, I think one of the big things that many competitive athletes struggle with is finding identity after sports. And so, I'm curious to know what was your process in finding, where were you going to get your competitive itch from, and how did you process all those feelings?
Yeah, that is a big, big one. I think that is something that I am learning to this day how to cope with. I've gone through different phases and stages. Part of what's been really difficult is that squash is not really big in Auburn in the South. So right now, I feel like sometimes there's like a little bit of a hole with just like I want to go play squash, or I just want to have like a community that we can go and like practice together, like whatever it is. So I have been getting bits and pieces of that by teaching my friends how to play squash. So there's one court here in Auburn, and I will always like be inviting people and just be like, "Hey, like, do you want to go learn how to play squash?" And it's fun because some friends too, I'll like keep playing with them, so they're getting better, and then that way I have somebody that I can play a little bit more and not just be like teaching, right? So that has been key. I think also whenever I go back home or I go visit some of my old teammates, we always play squash when we're together. So I think that's also a big part of it. Um, but I've been truly challenged to rediscover my whole relationship with exercising and working out. If I remember well, like right after finishing graduating, and like just being done with the season that we practiced, I think for the next 6 months, I was just not exercising at all. It was probably kind of a burnout point that I was like, oh wow, I can't remember the last time that I didn't have to think about like my training routine, you know? So I just stopped it altogether for a couple of months. I was like still walking and being active because that was just not gonna change after. But I was definitely not trying to schedule or plan or force myself to go work out because I was respecting my body and maybe like just this new phase that we were getting used to, right? Um, so since then, I've been growing and just learning different things that I like to do for a workout. So that might be a dance workout, or that might be walking with a friend, playing tennis, like we did. But I think it's just been a rediscovery and reconditioning my mind too, because to this day, sometimes if I just have a workout that wasn't very challenging, I don't feel like I worked out at all. And that goes back to the athlete mindset, right? It's like I need to be in pain or I need to like I don't know, like get like like beat myself, like myself from yesterday, in order to feel like I've accomplished something and actually did a good workout. So I've been working on that, trying to be a little lighter on myself and just understanding that it's a different dynamic now, but also respecting the fact that I had to think like that when I was an athlete in order to be able to achieve great things. So
That's the hardest part after we basically have retired from our sport and then finding what is going to fill that void. And I I was able to resonate what you just said as far as having a workout and not feeling the pain. And I
mhm,
still to this day sometimes when I have workouts and I'm like, my hamstrings aren't as tight or sore as they should be. And just going back to some of the workouts that I used to do as an
yeah.
athlete, um, so going over to so you've basically had to revamp and kind of find your space from a competitive nature. How have you found your identity just individually from a career standpoint after, being in Virginia, now here at Auburn? How have you found yourself in that regard?
Yeah, I think everything kind of ties back together a little bit in the sense that I chose to work as a mental health professional as well. So I think from my past experiences as an athlete, seeing how much being in therapy has helped me was kind of what prompted me to be a therapist. I had to go through a little bit of a shift just because I didn't pick like sports psychology or anything that was directly related to sports. But I think it's still the common theme of just like helping other people and like learning more about myself, which were things that I had to do as an athlete and as I sought help as well throughout my career. But I think it's just been finding more of my identity now as a marriage and family therapist and a retired squash athlete. So I still like play when I have some free time, or I'll still like teach other people how to play, or sometimes I'll be watching squash matches like at the professional level on the TV, or even just like traveling to competitions to see some of my friends. So different things like that, and hopefully even another thing that I want to bring back to my routine once I graduate from my master's program is competing again potentially. So trying to find different tournaments that are going on and just practicing for that one event and having that be like still a part of my life but not my main, like it's not the profession that I chose, right? And I think that's a big thing that retired athletes struggle with as well, is just that decision of like, I'm not going to follow this as my profession, right?
Absolutely. And interesting that you said that it basically has come full circle
Mhm.
from your experiences when you were younger to working with the, or from working with the sports psychologist and now being in the space of marriage and family therapy. And so
Mhm.
it's kind of interesting how things connect and our experiences kind of dictate some of the things or decisions that we make in the future. So that's really cool. I'm kind of moving forward now. One of the last things I want to ask you. So now that you're in the Auburn's marriage and family therapy program, I'm curious to know, how has your experience been learning and growing from Dr. Scott Kettering and Dr. Josh Novak?
Mhm. Well, it's been fascinating just like getting to interact with them, as well as my peers on a regular level. I think like one thing that I've really appreciated about this program is the degree of discussions that we engage on about all sorts of topics. But I think much of sometimes like when we're talking about like breakthroughs in therapy and things like that, I have even used like athlete examples with like Dr. Scott Kettering, or we've talked about like maybe he was under like he was explaining a concept and I couldn't get it, and he was like, "Okay, pretend like this is you. You're like about to play this match and this is happening. Like, what do you do?" Kind of thing. So I think it's just like it's been very fascinating to have them help me now as a growing marriage and family therapist, but also tying it back to some of my previous experiences as an athlete. And just really like being appreciative of the fact that my previous experiences have got me where I am today, right? Like, I remember in my interview, like talking about some of my experiences as an athlete or as a captain on the team at UVA. So I think it's just been amazing to learn from them, connect with them. We do explore a lot of things like eating disorders, just different like exercise, body positivity, body image kind of things in therapy because we see a lot of clients that will have complaints or sometimes not so healthy mindsets about some of those things, right? So just kind of reading ourselves, trying to understand where we are at in some of those things and how can we better help other people, has been fascinating. And having both Dr. Josh Novak and Scott Kettering help me through that has been impressive.
If you weren't here at Auburn University, where do you think you would have been?
That's an interesting one. I think I've definitely had a moment that I was like, wait, do I want to be a professional squash athlete? So that maybe I would have gone that route instead. I think it's just tricky, especially thinking about squash because it's not that big of a sport, it's not that popular, and even having a life that is financial stable through the sport can be something very different, very difficult to achieve. So I don't know, maybe in a parallel universe, I would have made it and that would have worked out. But I am sure that like new challenges would have come with that, right? So I think it's hard to say. I can't really see myself anywhere else because I think I'm getting to a place at which I can combine those different interests and build a life off of them, right? So I always tell people this, like when they're asking, like, "Oh, you're not playing that much anymore." I'm like, "Well, I'm always going to be a squash player. Like it's a part of who I am, and I can assure you that I'm always going to be finding a court and playing every now and then." So, yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. Your identity or part of you will always be a squash athlete, which I think a
Mhm,
lot of athletes also kind of have that same mindset. Once an athlete, always an athlete.
mhm, mhm,
So you're coming up on graduating pretty soon, and it seems like
Mhm.
it's probably forever away for you, but it's not too
Yes.
far away. What's the future hold for you? What do you see yourself doing after you graduate, and where do you want to be in the next 5 years?
Well, I hope to go more into private practice. So I've been applying, interviewing for some jobs here and there. And I'm just gonna follow that lead at first, and then hopefully in 5 years or a little bit more, be at a place that I can have my own private practice would be something that I'm interested on. I also think the way like being an athlete and squash have kind of dictated my future a little bit is that I will be moving to a higher like to a bigger like city just to make sure that I am able to play squash and have a community. Um so hopefully we'll see. I'll be like in Atlanta or some other city that has a squash community. And that way I'll be able to regain some aspects of that part of me.
Love it. I love it. Gio, I appreciate you taking the time to be on today's episode. And I have no doubt in my mind that you'll be successful, especially with the competitive drive and the competitive nature that you have. I think there's something to be said that, us athletes have this different drive about us that we want to compete and we want to win. And
Mhm.
we don't want, I guess, kind of like the Mamba mentality. We want to kind of, for lack of better words, it's crush the competition.
Yeah.
And I think that will always be with us athletes. So, Gio, again, thank you for taking the time to be on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for having me. That was
Yeah,
really fun to talk about some of these experiences.
absolutely. All right, so as we wind down today's episode, again, you can find Coats in Conversation on YouTube. You can also find Coats in Conversation on Apple or Spotify. Be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. What was the best part of this episode that you enjoyed? We always like to have further discussion after the actual episode. So, again, leave a comment below. Again, Gio, I thank you. And any listeners or watchers out there, we definitely appreciate you taking the time to tune in today. And